DNA in a cup helps identify the killer of a young woman 46 years after the crime. That's right. 46 years later, this case that we will discuss today has been solved. Lindy Sue Biechler was born on January 31, 1956. Her parents are Wayne L. Little and Edna Little. When she was little, her parents separated and she continued to live with her mother. Her father, in turn, remarried and had a brother, Michael Little. Michael, giving a spoiler about this subject, is a very important person in the conduct of his sister's case. Even after everything that happened, he always strived to bring justice for Lindy's story and became one of the main references in the fight to find out what happened to his sister, so he was very important. In high school, Lindy met Philip, who was the man who would later become her husband. At that time, Philip worked at Hertz, a very famous car rental company in the United States. And along with his work, he also attended Millersville University, a state college where he studied art. Lindy, at the time, attended Conestoga Valley High School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where she received business training. In October 1974, she and Philip were married. Philip was 5 years older than Lindy at 24, while she was 19, so he was already working and in a different phase of his life when they got married. The year after their wedding, in June 1975, she became the first employee hired by Landis Flowers and Gifts, a florist in Manor Township. She and her husband lived on the first floor of an apartment, but she never felt safe. One day she saw someone watching her apartment through the front door, which was made of glass. After that episode, she even told Philip that she didn't want to be alone at home when it got dark, because he came home from work much later than she did. Another incident, even more serious than this one, happened one night when Lindy and Phil were at home having dinner with her brother Michael. They were having a quiet evening, talking, laughing, drinking, until at a certain point they heard a noise coming from the bedrooms. Phil went there to see what had happened and found a mirror completely shattered. Lindy was devastated that day, and what was already causing her some fear ended up intensifying. When Michael left dinner, she made her husband check all the doors and windows of the house to make sure that nothing and no one would enter without them knowing. She was visibly emotionally weakened by this. After a year of marriage, they decided it would be best to start looking for a place to live again. Lindy really wanted a dog, and Phil wanted more space in the house. So their desires coincided, and they started looking for this new place to live. At 5:15 p.m. on December 5, 1975, Lindy grabbed her purse, left work, and drove from the flower shop to where Phil worked at Hertz so she could say hello before heading home. Then she went to John Herr's Village Market to do some shopping. She bought 4 bags of groceries and drove home, arriving around 6:30 p.m. She unpacked her groceries, put them inside the house, and stayed home alone until Phil got home from work. Since everyone knew Lindy was afraid of being home alone, her aunt and uncle Mel and Celeste decided to invite her to watch a basketball game that night, so she wouldn't be home alone waiting for Phil for hours. Around 8 p.m., Lindy's aunt and uncle arrived at her apartment to pick her up and take her to the basketball game with them. Celeste got to the door first and thought it was strange that Lindy had left it unlocked. This didn't make much sense, especially since everyone knew how cautious she was about her own safety. Even so, Celeste decided to enter the house. When she entered, she noticed that the living room light was on, but there was no one there either. She started calling for Lindy, but she couldn't hear anything. No noise, no movement, and no response from her. Celeste noticed that there were some grocery bags in the living room, so she continued walking through the house until she entered the kitchen, and that's when she came across a disturbing scene. Lindy was fully dressed, lying on her back on the floor with a butcher knife stuck in her neck and a dish towel wrapped around the wooden handle of the knife. Desperate, Celeste picked up the phone and immediately called 911, who arrived at the scene in no time. When the police entered and came across the crime scene, they already knew that it was a murder. Soon after identifying the crime scene, the police called Phil, Lindy's husband, and her parents to report what had happened. Lindy's father's reaction was very violent, so they were worried that something might happen to him because of this news. While still in the apartment, the police began to search every room looking for any clue or trace that could help them build this case. But surprisingly, nothing was out of place, and they didn't notice any missing objects or possessions. So, right away, a robbery motive would not be considered for this case. The initial idea was that the crime was sexually or gender-based. But although no signs of aggression were seen on the victim or that the doors had been broken into, the idea was that the killer probably knew the victim or used great cunning to enter the house without her noticing. Detectives from the Manor Township Police Department and the Pennsylvania State Police were responsible for conducting the investigation into the homicide. First, some information was uncovered through DNA testing. The evidence was sent to several labs, and several suspect interviews were completed to help in this process. DNA from the scene showed that there were droplets of Lindy's blood on the walls and also indicated that the victim had fought for her life. In addition, police also found some footprints in the kitchen, which they suspected were those of a man. The investigation continued with police interviewing Phil and Lindy's neighbors to try to find out any information that could help in the investigation of the case. The nearby neighbors were not home at the time of the crime and were unable to provide any information to the police that would help them understand what happened at that time. Lindy's autopsy came back and indicated that she had been stabbed 19 times, including a stab wound to the heart. Basically, they identified two knives. First, the butcher knife, the one that was found at her neck when her aunt entered the kitchen. The other knife was not identified as belonging to Lindy's apartment, so the police assumed that the killer himself had brought this second knife to the crime scene and then taken it away with him. The butcher knife, on the other hand, belonged to Lindy and Phil. The conclusion that Lindy died was due to massive bleeding. It is believed through the investigation that she was stabbed first in the neck, with the main stab wound with the butcher knife, and then continued to be stabbed in other parts of the body. By February 7, 1976, the police had interviewed about 300 people, but found no information. Months later, it was discovered that another woman, who was 43 years old, had been stabbed dozens of times in a situation very similar to Lindy's crime. The police soon noticed the similarities between the cases and became alert to the investigation. Months later, a man named Kenneth Dale Arndt was found guilty and arrested for the crime against this second victim and was removed from the Lindy investigation. The months went by and there was no more evidence or news about what had happened to Lindy. At the end of December of that year, when it had been 1 year since Lindy's death, her family went to the cemetery to leave some flowers in memory of her death anniversary. When they arrived, they came across Lindy's headstone painted all red and with scratch marks. It was the only vandalized headstone in the cemetery. The following year, marked as urgent, a letter arrived at the Manor Township Police Department and was addressed to Detective Sheila. The letter was written in both cursive and block letters. Basically, it was a letter divided into two parts. The first part was written as if someone was claiming to be the killer, and the second part was from Janice, a person who claimed to be a friend of the killer. The letter went something like this. Period. Hello, Sheila. You haven't caught me yet. Lindy's grave just got me excited. She looked all bloody like the painting. The scratch and cut marks represent the stab wounds. Print this letter along with a picture in the Lancaster paper on Friday night and in the Saturday morning paper, and I can confess when I get back from my trip. You see, the world owes me a living. Maybe I'll give you some insight into who I am. I was arrested once for drugs a few years ago. I live in the west end of Lancaster suburbs. I'm 5 feet 7 inches tall and fat and handsome and capable of killing again without knowing it. On December 5th, 1975, I was high on amphetamines. I am a well-educated man in the community, single, a good catch, but God help me. I am losing my mind. Help me before I kill again. The headaches are killing me. Drugs only temporarily soothe me. God forgive me. Please print this in the paper so I know you understand. I write to you again. God, I need a priest. What have I done? The second letter went something like this. Period. Please help me, Deputy Biechler. My friend has confessed to the murder of Lindy Biechler. Do as he asks. Print this letter on the front page. I am not aware of his intentions now, but contemplating murder is not his intention. He is mentally ill. When the letter appears in the paper, he will turn himself in. He described the relationship he and Lindy had before he killed her. He only realizes this now. He was on drugs and was not responsible for his actions. Please, he is sleeping now. That is why I finished the letter. All I can say is that my friend frequents the Manor Mall at night and the surrounding campus, mostly during the week. He will contact you very soon, and, when he does, please bring a Catholic priest to the station. Janice Crum. The police were not convinced that the letter was real. There were few details in the content that was written, basically everything that had been reported in the newspapers after Lindy's death. Even though the police requested that the newspaper be published, they felt it best not to release anything for now because it could somehow interfere with the investigation that was already underway at the time. In 1997, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office said that it submitted evidence from the crime scene for DNA analysis and a male profile had been extracted from Biechler's underwear. 3 years later, the DNA profile was submitted to a national database, also known as CODIS, to see if there was a match to a known criminal. Normally, if a person is not a known criminal, they would not be in the CODIS system, and therefore no match would be produced, as was the case here, the district attorney's office explained. In June 2006, Lindy's case was selected by the Video CQ Society for inclusion in its program. The CQ is a group of 50 volunteers, including forensic scientists, psychologists, and some members of the police force, who come together to analyze cases that have previously been handled by the police and never been solved. The county's chief detective stated at the time, "When you have a case that you have worked diligently on for years, and you think you have exhausted most of your leads, the perfect mechanism to have is a group of people like this." In January 2019, the investigation gained new momentum after it was taken over by the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office's Cold Case Unit, and months later enlisted the help of Parabon Nanolabs to analyze DNA collected in the case. Sinopoli was identified as a possible suspect, said C.C. Moore, a researcher at Parabon Nanolabs. Because there were no individual genetic matches to the suspect's DNA, Moore had to try a new and non-traditional route to narrow down the pool of potential suspects, he said. Given Sinopoli's Italian ancestry, Moore studied geographic and immigration patterns as well as associated surnames, and determined that the person linked to the DNA sample had ties to Gasparina, a town in the Calabria region of southern Italy. There were very few people living in Lancaster at the time of the crime who were the correct age and sex, and had a family tree consistent with those origins, so this allowed me to prioritize candidates whose ancestry was determined exclusively from families with origins in Gasparina, Moore said. Sinopoli and Biechler lived in the same 4-unit apartment complex at some point, Adams said during a press conference Monday, but did not specify when. Aside from being neighbors, Adams did not elaborate on how the two may have connected. David Sinopoli, as he was getting ready to catch a flight at Philadelphia International Airport, decided to have a cup of coffee that would change his life forever. Unbeknownst to him, investigators were following him and collected the cup he discarded after using it for analysis. David and Lindy were neighbors, but investigators did not know the relationship between them. Thanks to a search that compared DNA samples collected from Lindy's clothing and saliva on the coffee cup David drank at the airport, the killer's DNA profile was discovered. According to District Attorney Adams, who was leading the case, detectives had long believed the suspect had cut himself during the attack, which is why there were bloodstains on Lindy's clothes. David Sinopoli is charged with criminal homicide and is being held without bail in Lancaster County.